My father never abandoned us, Marcus Freeman whispered in the small apartment, his eyes fixed on the television screen where a black preacher delivered a sermon. But those words offered no comfort. They only deepened the void within him. 25 years ago, his father, Reverend Elijah Freeman, vanished without a trace. No grave, no answers. Only suspicion remained, and a wounded black community living in the shadow of rumors. This morning, a phone call shattered the silence. We found a bag buried under a tree in the Ozark forest, with a Bible inscribed with your father's name. Marcus dropped the remote, his heart pounding. After all these years, was the truth rising from the earth? Or was a darker secret about to be uncovered? The narrow road leading out of town was shrouded in morning mist, the shadows of trees stretching long across the damp ground. Marcus Freeman sat rigid in the back of the police car, his hands clasped tightly as if trying to steady his racing heart. The scenery blurred by weathered wooden porches of old houses, a closed general store, the faded sign of the Baptist church with letters worn by time. Somewhere, the church bell tolled, reminding him that memories never sleep. The car turned onto a dirt path deep into the Ozark forest. The air shifted, swallowed by a sea of dense leaves, with morning light filtering through like fragile silk ribbons. Marcus stared out the window, replaying the morning's call. Detective Miller's words still echoed: an old Adidas bag, a pastoral robe, a Bible inscribed with Elijah Freeman's name. All lay buried under a rotting oak, as if the earth had swallowed the truth for decades, waiting for the day it would resurface. When the car stopped, Marcus stepped out, his shoes sinking into the damp soil. The air carried the scent of rotting wood and rich earth, mingled with faint smoke from a generator the police were using. Before him, yellow tape encircled an ancient tree, where officers and workers gathered. Camera flashes pulsed, capturing every detail of a moment this town thought was buried forever. Marcus paused, staring at the tree's base. The soil had been dug up, broken roots exposed, revealing the hollow where the bag was found. The faded Adidas sports bag lay on a white tarp, still caked with dirt. It was unremarkable, yet it tightened Marcus's chest, as if touching it would pull him back to 1977, the day his life fell into a void. An officer knelt to open the bag, latex gloves gleaming in the sunlight. A musty odor rose instantly, the smell of something long trapped underground. They pulled out a pastoral robe, its coarse fabric frayed but still bearing faint white stains at the collar. Then came the Bible, its leather cover cracked, pages stuck together by moisture. On the top corner of the first page, the familiar handwriting remained: Reverend Elijah Freeman. Marcus's chest tightened. Those letters, those familiar strokes, felt like a hand from the past gripping him. He turned away, but his eyes were wet. 25 years, and this was the first trace. Not a memory, not a story, but something tangible, undeniable proof that his father had been here, had left a mark in this ancient forest. Marcus stepped back, trying to breathe. The sound of pins scratching, boots crunching on dry leaves. Detective Miller directing the forensic team, it all faded, as if he stood in a heavy dream. In his mind, old images flooded back. His father in a bright robe, standing at the Mount Olive church pulpit, his warm voice resonating in the vibrant, stained glass sanctuary. His mother in the front pew, her gentle hand on her teenage son's shoulder. The hymns of that time blended with today's forest wind, sending a shiver through him. Part of him wanted to believe this was a harmless clue, that his father had left for some reason and buried these items. But another part, the deepest, most painful part, knew these objects didn't bury themselves. Someone had placed them here, deliberately hidden, and someone knew the truth. Marcus looked toward the deep forest, where tree shadows formed a dense wall. The wind rustled the leaves, like faint whispers. This small town had lived in that silence for a quarter century, so quiet that even Marcus began to doubt his own memories. Now, that silence had cracked. An officer approached, handing him rubber gloves. Marcus reluctantly put them on and stepped toward the folding table where the evidence lay. He leaned down, looking at the Bible again, its yellowed, mold-stained pages. Miraculously, his father's handwriting endured, surviving earth, rain, and time. Tucked at the back was a small paper, scrawled with trembling words, a prayer pleading for God's guidance through sin and darkness. Marcus read, his throat tightening. This wasn't a man who planned to abandon his family. This was a father who fought until his final moment. He closed his eyes, letting the pain surge like a tide. The sky above the forest brightened, but in Marcus's heart, only darkness lingered. He knew, from this moment, his life would never be the same. What was pulled from the earth today wasn't just a tattered bag. It was a door to a truth someone had sworn to keep buried forever. And Marcus, whether he wanted it or not, had become the one to walk through that door. Dear listeners, pause for a moment to subscribe to the channel before continuing with the main story, but only if you truly connect with what I'm sharing here. Leave a comment below letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is. It's fascinating to see people from all over joining us. That afternoon, the town seemed cloaked in a layer of dusty memories. Marcus drove his old car along the narrow road to Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church, once the spiritual heart of the local Black community, where his father delivered soul-stirring sermons. The church now looked aged and lonely. White paint peeled in large patches, the wooden door sagged on its hinges, and the small bell tower was covered in green moss, as if the building itself had bowed to time's weight. Marcus parked at the steps, his hands still gripping the steering wheel. A storm of conflicting emotions churned within him, fear of facing the past and a longing to touch it again. The wooden door creaked as he pushed it open, the scent of old wood and candle wax rushing over him, a familiar aroma from childhood. Inside, golden light from stained glass windows spilled onto the floor, casting fragmented patches of red, blue, and purple on the dark wood. Everything seemed frozen since the day his father vanished. The long pews, the polished wooden pulpit, the cross hanging high on the wall. Marcus stepped forward, his shoes echoing hollowly, evoking countless Sundays when he sat listening to his father's resonant voice. His heart twisted. For years, he'd avoided this place like an untouchable wound. Now, every detail stabbed at his memories. Up ahead, an elderly figure stood stooped near the altar, silver hair gleaming, back slightly hunched but eyes bright. It was Pastor Harold Whitmore, who once worked alongside Marcus's father. He turned, startled, then broke into joy upon recognizing Marcus. The warmth in his eyes made Marcus pause. So many years, so much distance, yet the affection remained unchanged. They shared a brief embrace, a touch that spoke more than words. Before Marcus could settle, another set of footsteps echoed. A tall man with graying stubble and a heavy gait entered from the back door. Reverend George Langston. He, too, had preached here, a right-hand man of the church. His face flickered with surprise, then eased into a slow smile. For a fleeting moment, Marcus thought he saw a glint in his eyes, both familiar and guarded. They sat in a small room off the church's side. On the wall, photos of past pastors hung neatly, with his father's image in the center, eyes blazing with faith. Marcus touched the frame lightly, as if seeking warmth. Harold and George watched in silence. Marcus didn't waste time. He mentioned the forest discovery, the Bible with his father's signature, and asked directly, "Did my father ever say anything before he disappeared? Did you notice anything unusual?" "Hey." The question hung in the quiet wooden room, echoing into the heavy air. Harold bowed his head, his aged hands clutching an old hymnal. George avoided Marcus's gaze, eyes fixed on the window. After a long pause, Harold spoke, his voice hoarse but firm. Marcus's father was a man devoted to God, giving every breath to the community. But in his final nights before vanishing, he spent hours in the church office, praying until exhaustion. George interjected, saying he often heard groans in the night, as if Elijah wrestled with a pain too deep to share. They didn't know exactly, only sensed the darkness had enveloped the man. Marcus sat still. Their words were both truth and a void. He knew his father wasn't weak. He knew his father preached that the truth will set us free. So why were his father's 1,977 notes missing? Why had his personal journal vanished? Elijah, who recorded every sermon, every line, left an entire pivotal year blank. Marcus pressed, and Harold's eyes flickered with unease. They searched the old office, rifling through bookshelves and drawers, but only dust and newer documents remained. No trace. They moved to the church library, where towering shelves reeked of old paper. Marcus set down the old sermon book he'd brought for comparison, then carefully scanned the shelves. An hour passed, yielding nothing. He stood silently in the library, late afternoon light casting long shadows through the windows. The old question returned. Had his father vanished, or been erased? The missing 1,977 records meant someone had deliberately hidden them, but who and why? Before leaving, Marcus knelt at a pew in the sanctuary. For the first time in years, he whispered a prayer, his voice trembling as if speaking to someone lost. If you're still listening, show me the truth. Don't let me wander anymore. He rose and left the church in silence. Behind him, the setting sun bathed the old bell tower in gold. Meanwhile, the old sermon book he'd brought remained forgotten on the library table, buried among silent stacks. A small detail, but one that would ignite the path he was about to tread. All right, dear listeners, if you're enjoying this story, comment 1 or I'm still here to keep listening. The afternoon sun dipped behind low hills, painting the Arkansas sky in a long, deep red streak. Marcus left the church but, instead of driving back to his apartment, turned onto a narrow road toward the cemetery on the town's outskirts. Memories of his mother Sarah Freeman flooded back as he passed through the creaking iron gate, its two wings groaning as if mourning with each opening. The cemetery sat on a gentle slope, dotted with gray tombstones under the shade of ancient oaks. The air was heavy with the scent of earth and wild grass, broken only by the faint chirping of late-season cicadas. Marcus carried a small bouquet, bought hastily from a roadside shop. It had been years since he'd returned, yet each step felt etched in his heart. He found his mother's grave, its simple stone inscribed, "Beloved wife and mother Sarah Freeman, 1,941,976. He knelt, placing the flowers on the grass, letting memories rush over him. When his mother died suddenly of illness, his father still stood at the pulpit, his voice trembling but resolute. Elijah Freeman had clung to faith, but now Marcus realized how crushing that blow must have been. Perhaps it was the beginning of everything, a fracture no one could mend. He sat on the grass, speaking softly to the grave as if to the living. His whispered words broke in the wind, recounting the bag's discovery, the Bible with his father's name, and the missing notebooks. He confessed his years of anger, admitting he'd turned from God not from disbelief, but from the unbearable void left behind. His eyes blurred with tears. Suddenly, a faint sound interrupted his thoughts, a small, stifled sob. Marcus looked up, scanning the empty cemetery, and spotted a boy crouched under a tree a few rows away. His worn jacket hung loose, his face streaked with tears. He couldn't be more than 10. Marcus approached cautiously, not wanting to startle him. The boy looked up, eyes wet, lips trembling as if to speak, but choking on the words. Before Marcus, a small headstone appeared, a woman's name, same surname Hark, likely his mother. No words were needed, Marcus understood. An orphan, recently bereaved, sitting alone in the cemetery as dusk fell. He sat beside the boy, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. Heat radiated from the small body. The boy was feverish. His forehead burned, lips cracked. Marcus sighed, a strange sense of duty stirring. He remembered himself, a teenager who lost his anchor. Sitting lost in this same cemetery 25 years ago, darkness began to swallow the cemetery. Marcus promised to take the boy to a hospital, but the boy shook his head weakly, whispering he didn't want to return to his aunt and uncle, where he felt unwelcome. Those simple words pierced Marcus. He knew too well the feeling of being pushed beyond love's boundaries. In his hesitation, the boy mentioned something odd. His mother used to take him to Mount Olive, bringing home communion when he was sick. It brought him peace. Marcus froze. Communion, once the breath of his childhood, then forgotten for years. Yet now, a stranger's child rekindled it. Marcus reassured him, promising to retrieve communion from the church, but insisting they go to the hospital first to break the fever. The boy nodded reluctantly. Marcus helped him up, feeling the small body tremble beside him. They left the cemetery in silence, the crescent moon hanging low, lighting their steps. In Marcus's mind, a nagging thought. Why, on the day he returned to the cemetery, did he meet this boy? Was it chance, or a link to the secret still hidden? As he started the car, the boy leaned back, eyes closed, breathing heavily. Marcus glanced one last time at his mother's grave. In the darkness, the headstone faded, but a thread had reconnected in his heart. From a mother lost early, to a vanished father, to the orphaned child before him. All seemed to lead to one place, Mount Olive, where the truth still slept. Unbeknownst to him, as he left the cemetery, his father's old sermon book remained forgotten on the church library table. A trivial detail, but one that would unlock the most dangerous discoveries. The county hospital cast a cold white glow on the gray tile floor. Marcus handed the boy, Robbie, to the nurse, signing temporary forms, then stood silently outside the emergency room. As the doctor took Robbie for tests, Marcus felt an odd emptiness within. He'd promised to return with communion, but in this moment, what he truly needed was to face his own darkness. Leaving the hospital, he drove back to Mount Olive. Night had fully fallen, the dirt road to the church, sinking into darkness, with only silver moonlight on the oak trees. The church loomed like a heavy black mass, its stained glass windows reflecting faint glimmers. Inside, the empty foyer glowed dimly under a single yellow bulb, with a young worker sweeping the floor. Marcus asked about Pastor Harold and Reverend George, but the worker shook his head. They were at the cemetery behind the church, holding a prayer service. Marcus frowned. In his memory, pastors rarely held services at night, especially not in a cemetery. He said nothing more, only asking the worker to open the library so he could retrieve his father's sermon book, left behind. In the library, fluorescent light bathed the towering shelves. The sermon book sat neatly on the table where he'd left it. Marcus picked it up, relieved, scanning the room. He noticed something odd. A book on the highest shelf was misaligned, as if recently touched. He reached for it, but it was heavy, slipping from his grasp and crashing to the floor. The cover read, Church Financial Management and Stewardship. Marcus bent to pick it up, and his heart stopped. In the book's margin, familiar bold handwriting appeared, his father's. Flipping through, he saw underlined passages, notes on transparency, accountability to God and the community. But what chilled him were faint, erased marks, visible only when tilted under the light. Two names, Harold Whitmore and George Langston, circled with question marks. Marcus closed the book, clutching it tightly. A shiver ran down his spine. His father had suspected something. His father had known something, and perhaps that was why he vanished. The young worker returned with a prepared communion kit. Marcus took it, thanked him, but his eyes remained on the book. In his mind, pieces began to shift. Missing sermon notes, a vanished journal, and now, a financial book with hidden notes, tucked on a high shelf as if waiting to be found. All pointed in one direction. Before leaving, Marcus paused in the hallway, peering through a window toward the cemetery. In the dim darkness, he saw two figures hunched over a mound of earth. One held a shovel, digging, while the other clutched a bag. The faint light revealed their forms, Reverend George and Pastor Harold. Marcus held his breath, heart pounding. The scene was too strange. Who digs in a cemetery at this hour? And what was in that bag? He stepped back from the window, careful not to be seen. Questions swirled. Was this coincidence, or part of the truth his father had tried to expose? Marcus gripped the book tightly. He knew, from this moment, every path would lead to danger. But he also knew, if he turned away, the truth would stay buried forever. He left the church, hurrying to the parking lot, carrying the sermon book, the financial book, and the communion kit. As he slid into the driver's seat, he glanced back one last time. Through the fogged window, the shadows of the two pastors lingered, like men guarding a secret too vast to share. Marcus started the car, but his heart surged. An instinct told him his father's disappearance was never random. And tonight, in the church cemetery, the bones of truth were stirring beneath the earth. The empty road out of town wound like a dark thread, curling around hills and vanishing into the misty Ozark forest. Marcus sat in the car, hands gripping the wheel, heart racing. The sparse streetlights cast patchy glows on the wet pavement. As he left the church parking lot, a sight in the rearview mirror froze him. Reverend George, hastily loading a shovel and a canvas bag into the trunk of a dark sedan. The car roared to life, speeding out of the cemetery via another exit. Marcus sat stunned for a moment, then, driven by instinct, turned the wheel and followed into the darkness. George's taillights flickered ahead, red like fleeing eyes. Marcus trailed at a safe distance, dimming his headlights to avoid notice. The scenery shifted. Scattered wooden houses gave way to endless dark trees, towering like a giant wall. The road narrowed, twisting upward. The sound of tires grinding on gravel echoed like a drumbeat in his ears. The car's interior felt thick with tension. Marcus dialed Detective Miller, his voice urgent but controlled, reporting that he was following Reverend George. On the other end, Miller urged him to keep his distance, avoid confrontation, and promised police backup. Marcus nodded, but deep down, he knew he couldn't let go. The mountain road was eerily quiet. George's lights flickered between trees, vanishing around sharp turns. Marcus wondered, why was George driving to this remote place at night, with a shovel and bag? The only answer he dared touch chilled him, destroying evidence. A sign flashed in his headlights. Eagle Point Overlook, 1 mile. A rare lookout over the valley, the road's end. Marcus swallowed hard. If George was headed there, he needed solitude for something only the night could witness. Sure enough, George's brake lights flared. His sedan veered into a wide gravel lot, stopping under overhanging trees. Marcus parked over 100 meters back, hidden behind a curve. From his seat, George's headlights cut a sharp beam through the night. Marcus killed the engine, heart pounding as if it might burst. He watched George open the trunk, pulling out the heavy bag and shovel. His back bent under the weight, his shadow stretching long on the gravel. Without hesitation, George followed a wooden staircase down a narrow path along the cliff's edge. Marcus bit his lip. Part of him wanted to wait for the police, but every second could erase evidence of his father. He grabbed a small flashlight, clutching it tightly, and stepped out, moving carefully toward the flickering light ahead. Wind whipped fiercely on the hilltop, carrying the cold scent of wet grass. The darkness was thick, like a blanket, with only George's flashlight blinking in the distance. Each step Marcus took made the old wooden path creak, threatening to betray his silence. He reached a lower platform where the trail hugged the cliff's edge. The river below was a faint silver thread in the moonlight. Ahead, Reverend George stopped, setting the bag down. He bent, trembling hands untying it, preparing to cast something into the abyss. Marcus stood a few dozen paces away, sweat beating cold on his back. He couldn't wait. His voice cut through the wind, hoarse, "Reverend George." The man flinched, spinning around. The flashlight's beam swept across his face, revealing a mix of horror and anger. For a moment, their eyes locked, and Marcus knew there was no turning back. Far off, police sirens wailed, tearing through the night. The police sirens echoed from the hilltop road, distant but sharp enough to pierce the night. Wind howled across the cliff, carrying a chill mixed with the scent of damp earth. Marcus stood frozen, his flashlight casting a trembling beam. Ahead, Reverend George swayed, one hand clutching the heavy bag, the other gripping the shovel. His shadow loomed on the uneven ground, flickering like an uneasy specter. In that brief moment, the two men locked eyes, wordless. One, the son of a man who vanished, driven by a burning need for truth. The other, an aged pastor, eyes evasive, weighed down by something darker than the night. Marcus stepped forward slowly, the old wood creaking beneath his feet. He knew he was risking everything, but retreating would mean letting the truth fall into the abyss, as it had for years. George trembled, tightening his grip on the bag, then suddenly threw it to the ground. A heavy thud rang out, metal clanking dryly, not the sound of dirt or debris. Marcus's flashlight swept down, revealing the bag's open edge. Inside gleamed dusty hardcover notebooks, pages caked with dark soil. He instantly recognized his father's familiar handwriting on the covers, the missing 1,977 sermon notes and journals. Marcus's heart surged. These were the clues he'd sought for years, proof his father hadn't left willingly. George collapsed to his knees, his face a mask of torment. He whispered something the wind swallowed, his eyes vacant. Marcus crouched, reaching for the bag, but George roared, lunging to wrest it back. The shovel swung through the air, striking the wooden floor with a harsh clang. Police headlights from the hilltop began to spill down, red and blue flashing, streaking the scene. Footsteps pounded from the staircase. The police were closing in, but still too far. Marcus didn't dare look away from George. The man backed toward the cliff's edge, sweat streaming down his wrinkled face in the faint light. His lips moved, as if confessing to the darkness itself. Marcus took another step, his voice hoarse, calling George's name, trying to stop him. But George shouted, his voice breaking in the wind. He couldn't be caught, couldn't face disgrace before the congregation, couldn't let the truth come to light. Then he turned, half his body leaning past the rickety wooden railing. In a split-second instinct, Marcus lunged, grabbing George's arm. The old man's body slipped in sweat and dirt, barely held. Marcus pulled hard, but the weight dragged them both toward the edge. Time slowed. Flashing lights, howling wind, distant sirens echoing. Just then, two officers charged down, seizing George's shoulders, yanking him back. He screamed, thrashing, preferring the abyss to justice. But Marcus held tight, refusing to let go. In the chaos, George was subdued, the shovel clattering on the wooden boards, ringing like a judgment bell. As the dust settled, George was handcuffed, his face pale, eyes red. The evidence bag lay on the ground, revealing two old notebooks and bone fragments mixed with dirt. Marcus sank down, sweat soaking his shirt, hands trembling but eyes fixed on the notebooks. He knew these were his father's final words, rising from the earth after 25 years. The police secured the bag, leading George away. Red and blue lights swirled, illuminating the dark cliff. Detective Miller approached, her gaze stern yet empathetic. Marcus couldn't speak, only touched the edge of a notebook, peeking from the plastic bag. In his mind, his father's voice echoed, words of integrity, of courage in facing evil. The forest night grew silent, save for the chirping crickets and Marcus's heavy breaths. Everything he'd witnessed, everything pulled from that bag, had changed everything. This wasn't just evidence for a case, it was a door to a crime buried by those who once stood at the pulpit. Marcus stood, gazing into the dark abyss below. Without the timely arrival, the evidence would have been lost forever. He knew, from this moment, he was no longer an outsider. He had touched the secret, and there was no going back. Are you still here, dear listeners? Take a moment to relax, maybe grab a glass of water, and keep listening to this gripping story. Comment 1. If you find it intriguing, don't forget to subscribe. The Ozark County Police Station glowed dimly on the quiet street. Patrol cars lined up, their red and blue lights flashing on the old brick walls. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and musty papers. Marcus entered, his shoes heavy as stone, clutching his father's newly found notebook, now sealed in a clear plastic bag. A long hallway led to a meeting room where evidence was spread on a metal table. The the worn Adidas bag, a dirt-caked shovel, 2 hardcover notebooks, and bone fragments extracted from the soil. The harsh fluorescent light made everything look like relics from a ghostly case unearthed from the ground. Marcus stared, his breath heavy. These weren't just objects. They were his father's return after 25 years of absence. Behind a one-way glass, Reverend George sat slumped in the interrogation room. Gone was the proud, dignified pastor. His crumpled shirt clung with sweat, his trembling hands rested on the table. His red-rimmed eyes were empty. Before him lay an open file, photos of the evidence bag, and the Bible inscribed with Elijah Freeman's name. Detective Miller sat across, her voice low, firm, not harsh but weighty. She didn't press, only asked simple questions, repeating them patiently. At first, George shook his head, dodging, claiming ignorance, calling it a misunderstanding, but his voice cracked, long pauses eroding his words' strength. Marcus, behind the glass, watched it all. He saw George's shoulders shake, his hands clench and release, like a man wrestling with old ghosts. When Miller set a notebook on the table, tapping the erased scrawl, George buried his face in his hands. In the quiet room, his aged sobs broke through, hoarse and uneven. Then he began to speak. No longer the pastor commanding the pulpit, just a man crushed by memory and guilt. He confessed, in 1977, Elijah Freeman uncovered discrepancies in the church's funds. He documented everything, preparing to expose it to the congregation. Harold and George, fearing ruined reputations and exposed finances, tried to silence him. But Elijah wouldn't yield. He planned to go public the following Sunday. On Friday night, in the church basement, a confrontation erupted. Words escalated, anger exploded. George recounted, his voice trembling like wind through dry leaves, how he and Harold lost control. They gripped tightly, and in a moment, Elijah's breath stopped. The room fell into a terrifying silence, a silence that haunted them for nearly half their lives. Marcus closed his eyes, fists clenched. His chest felt crushed, but he forced himself to hear every word. This was the truth he'd sought, but also the deepest cut. His father didn't abandon his family or flee his faith. He was killed by men within the church, by those called brothers. George continued, his voice faltering. The body was wrapped in an old robe, hastily buried under an empty grave in the church cemetery. To misdirect, they had a woodsman bury the Adidas bag with another robe, the Bible, and personal items under a large tree deep in the forest. A fabricated plan to sow belief that Elijah had forsaken his ministry and vanished. The white light illuminated George's wrinkled face, a map of deceit. He whispered that for 25 years, every sermon, he heard footsteps in the basement, felt Elijah's eyes watching. That night, digging up the grave, he could no longer bear the weight. He wanted to erase the evidence, to cast it into the abyss. But the truth had chosen its day to rise. Miller sat silently, taking notes, not interrupting. When George looked up, his eyes were cloudy but lighter, as if unburdened. Marcus, outside, turned away, his hands gripping the cold glass frame. The recorder ran, marking every word. And each word was an indelible verdict. In the same hallway, a second interrogation room blazed under white light. Pastor Harold sat upright, his shirt crisp, tie neat, as if ready to step onto the pulpit. His face wasn't creased with tears or trembling with remorse, but taut, cold. His eyes stared forward, unwavering, as if this were merely a temporary stage, and he remained the star. Detective Miller entered, carrying the file and evidence bag. She placed a photo of the notebooks unearthed from the Adidas bag on the table. The paper was yellowed, edges frayed, but Elijah's handwriting stood clear. Harold glanced at it briefly, then tilted his chin, as if it were just a worthless relic. Miller placed the transcript from the adjacent room, where George had just confessed, on the table. The sound echoed, broken sobs, a trembling voice recounting that night in 1977. With each word, Marcus, standing behind the one-way glass, felt his heart constrict. He waited for a reaction, any sign of wavering from Harold. But there was none. Harold sat still, hands clasped, eyes blinking slowly, his face indifferent. When the recording ended, the room's air grew thick. Miller tapped her pen lightly on the table and asked directly, "Do you have anything to say?" Harold gave a faint smile, a forced mask he'd worn too long. He claimed George had lost his mind to guilt, fabricating a story for belated forgiveness. He suggested Elijah Freeman might have left due to family pressures, grief over his wife's death, and that no one could be certain what happened. Miller didn't react. She slid the church's financial records toward him. Discrepancies, questionable funds, all underlined and annotated by Elijah. Harold flipped through the pages, calm as a seasoned accountant reviewing ledgers. He admitted to minor errors, possibly from the bookkeeper at the time, but insisted nothing proved embezzlement. Even with Elijah's handwritten notes, he dismissed them as personal speculation, not evidence. Marcus, watching from outside, felt the stark contrast. George had crumbled, broken by guilt. Harold, however, built a fortress of denial, clinging to a false calm. But in those cold eyes, Marcus glimpsed something else, a trace of tension, a flicker of panic, surfacing only when Miller mentioned the dirt-stained shovel and the bone fragments found. The interrogation room grew heavy. The wall clock ticked steadily, an invisible reminder. Harold remained there, refusing to confess, shedding no tears. He chose silence or denial, letting George bear the weight alone. Marcus stepped back from the glass, a wave of disgust rising within him. One man wept in his guilt, the other coldly concealed it. Both had destroyed his father, but at least George had let the truth break free. Harold cloaked it in a veneer of righteousness, as if he'd spent a lifetime perfecting lies even in the face of light. Detective Miller stepped into the hallway, sighing softly. She told Marcus the interrogation would drag on, but Harold was determined to deny everything. They'd rely on physical evidence, George's confession, and DNA analysis. Justice would come, but it wouldn't be easy. Marcus nodded, his eyes still fixed on the brightly lit room. In his mind, Harold was no longer the silver-haired pastor preaching forgiveness, but a smiling shadow, clinging to secrets until his last breath. The night deepened. Beyond the glass, the small town lay silent, unaware that truth was being unearthed in this room. For Marcus, another door had opened. The truth was near, but justice would require a fight. And Harold, with his icy eyes, wouldn't surrender easily. Dear listeners, if you're finding this story gripping, comment 1, or "I'm still here to keep listening." The police department's examination room was no larger than 2 classrooms combined, but under the stark fluorescent light, it felt like a surgical theater for memories. Stainless steel tables, lined up, tools, gloves, metal clips, and forensic lights all waiting for evidence pulled from 25 years of darkness. Marcus entered, his heart heavy. On the table before him, 2 hardcover notebooks sat carefully in clear plastic cases. Their leather covers were cracked, yellowed, pages stuck together with mold. A technician, wearing thin gloves, used a scalpel to gently separate the pages, as if a single rough move could turn them to dust. The room was silent. The sound of metal sliding across brittle paper was like a blade cutting into an old wound. Marcus stood close, heart pounding, eyes fixed on each slice. When a page opened, the light revealed faded words, but the familiar bold handwriting stood out, Elijah Freeman's. The technician angled the light, placing a magnifying glass over the text. Words emerged, incomplete, but enough to piece together a story. Marcus held his breath as they read slowly. "I can no longer stay silent. The missing funds exceed $10,000. They smile to my face, but their hands are stained. I will stand before the congregation and reveal it all." Marcus swayed, gripping the chair's edge. The words were a direct echo from his father's mind, confirming his suspicions were not baseless. Elijah had seen it, had resolved to expose it, and that resolve led to his cruel fate. The next page was blackened by mold, but the technician used ultraviolet light, revealing nearly invisible lines. They're not just stealing, they want me gone. I feel danger closing in, but justice belongs to God. I will not back down. Marcus closed his eyes, his chest tightening. Each word was a prophecy, a testament left for him. Elijah had sensed death nearing but wrote on, preparing for a sermon that might have been his last. The technician moved to the sermon notebook, in better condition, dry pages, clearer text. Sermons from early 1977 emerged, centered on integrity, courage, forgiveness. One, marked in bold red ink, was dated for the Sunday after his disappearance. Its title, The Courage to Face Evil with Love. Marcus leaned closer, eyes blurring with tears. In the margin, Elijah had written, "If I fall, the truth must still rise. No sin escapes the light." The room fell silent. Even the technician paused, letting the words hang in the air. Marcus felt a chill down his spine, but a fire ignited in his heart. For years, he'd resented his father, believing he'd abandoned them. Now, these words proved, Elijah never left. He chose to stand, and the cost was his life. An officer entered with an envelope containing preliminary forensic results. DNA from the bone fragments matched a hair sample from the Freeman family's old records. Marcus took the paper, hands trembling. There was no doubt, the remains were Elijah Freeman's. The father he'd lost was returned through truth, however painful. Detective Miller placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, her voice low but firm. "Justice won't stop here. These notebooks aren't just evidence. They're his testimony from beyond the grave." Marcus nodded, eyes shining through tears. He looked at the crumbling pages, as if his father sat there, still preaching, still urging him to finish the path. Clutching the forensic report, Marcus wondered, with this undeniable evidence, how would Harold react? And would the Mount Olive community, silent for 25 years, find the courage to face the truth? News spread without newspapers or flyers. In a small town, secrets travel on human feet and live through whispered rumors. Just one night after the interrogation, stories began circulating in the general store, at the gas station, in cramped living rooms over morning coffee. They said the police had found Elijah Freeman's remains. They said someone had confessed. They said Mount Olive, a symbol of black faith in the region, was no longer untarnished. Marcus drove near the church that morning. The usually quiet front yard was filled with people. Elderly congregants stood in small groups, clutching Bibles, eyes uneasy. Younger ones whispered, faces curious yet anxious. No one spoke loudly, but fear was evident in every gesture. The church, a refuge for decades, had become the eye of a storm. Marcus entered the foyer, his shoes echoing on the polished wood. The scene was both familiar and alien. Long pews, the pulpit, stained glass windows casting vibrant beams. But the atmosphere was different. No longer a place of peaceful prayer, it felt like an invisible courtroom, where everyone was witness, defendant, and victim at once. Some recognized Marcus and whispered his name. Elijah's son, the sound spread like a spark on dry straw. Eyes turned to him, pity, respect, but also wariness. In those gazes, Marcus saw the collective pain reflected. They'd lost not just a pastor but their innocence, the belief that this house could never be tainted. He approached the long wooden table where the church council usually met. Today, no Pastor Harold sat at the head, no George stood beside. Only a few elderly deacons remained, faces somber. They spoke quickly, voices low and trembling. They knew the truth could no longer be hidden. An older woman with silver hair, once the choir director, spoke up, her voice hoarse with emotion. She recalled Elijah's years at the pulpit, preaching justice and truth. She wept, saying perhaps they'd all turned away from him in silence, letting rumors replace answers. Others nodded, some covered their faces. A middle-aged man, once Harold's close friend, argued sharply that no conclusions should be drawn before a court ruling. He feared the community would fracture, that outsiders would exploit the rift. but his words were cut off by protests. Younger congregants said silence had killed Elijah, and the mistake couldn't be repeated. Marcus stood amid the storm, silent. He wasn't a judge or an impartial witness. He was the victim's flesh and blood. He looked at the faces some had comforted him when his mother died. Others brought him cookies at church fairs. Now all faced the truth they denied for years. In that moment, Marcus felt his father's burden. Elijah had stood here, alone, knowing enemies sat among the clergy, yet chose to confront them. Now, it was Marcus's turn to carry that torch. Though his hands trembled, he opened the restored sermon notebook, flipping to the red-marked page. His voice rang out, not a pastor's, but deep and steady, reading his father's words, "If I fall, the truth must still rise. No sin escapes the light." The room fell silent. The pews were still, only stifled breaths audible. The sermon from the past echoed in the present, as if Elijah had returned. Marcus looked up, his voice breaking but strong. This wasn't the time for fear or silence. It was the time for the community to prove they were bigger than the sins of a few, strong enough to heal through truth. In the multicolored light from the windows, some elders nodded, eyes wet. Younger members clasped each other's shoulders, finding shared strength. Even in the chaos, a small flame kindled, a restored faith, however painful. Marcus knew this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long, fraught with conflict, but the veil of silence had torn, and through that tear, light began to pour. That afternoon, Marcus returned to the hospital. The hallway smelled of antiseptic, nurses' shoes clicking steadily on the tiles. Robbie lay in bed, his face rosier after his fever broke, his clear eyes looking at Marcus with an odd trust, as if Marcus were family, not just a stranger who helped. Marcus sat, opening the communion kit, fulfilling his promise. Robbie smiled weakly, then pulled back his blanket, revealing a small, worn notebook. He clutched it, then held it out. His voice was hoarse but firm. "My mom left this. She was a secretary at Mount Olive. She said if the truth was ever buried, this book would speak." Marcus's hands trembled as he took it. The leather cover was frayed, corners singed as if it had survived a fire. He opened it, finding neat handwriting with dates, meeting notes, church income, and expenses. Not personal notes, but official records. As he flipped through, discrepancies appeared, numbers crossed out, altered, and in the margin, a small red ink note. Harold requested not to record, transferred privately. Marcus looked up, heart racing. Robbie continued, eyes tearing. "My mom told me she heard arguments in the office. Mr. Elijah wanted to tell the congregation everything, but then my mom died the next year. They said it was illness. But I remember, before she passed, she hugged me and said, 'Never trust their silence.'" Those words cut into Marcus's memories like a knife. He gripped the notebook, realizing this was the peace his father had sought. Not only had Elijah known the truth, Robbie's mother had, too. She kept records, and this notebook was proof that the crime was documented from within. He looked at Robbie, a mix of pain and gratitude swelling within. Two children, generations apart, both lost parents to the shadows around Mount Olive. Marcus placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, whispering, "Your mom was brave, like my father, and now you've passed on that torch." Outside the hallway, Detective Miller appeared. Marcus handed her the notebook. As she skimmed it, her sharp eyes lit up. This wasn't just new evidence, it was the key. It proved the deceit wasn't rumor but recorded in official books. Harold could no longer deny. Beyond the window, the sunset stretched wide, casting a heavy red glow into the room. Marcus sat with Robbie, letting silence envelop them. A truth rang clear in his heart. Elijah's death was no longer a personal tragedy. It was part of a larger tapestry where many knew but chose silence, where past whispers now became shouts demanding to be heard. Robbie looked up, asking softly, "Mr. Marcus, do you think God forgot us?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. He gazed outside, where the deep purple sky met the horizon, then turned back, shaking his head. No, sometimes we think so. But maybe he's just waiting for the right moment to let the light shine. Robbie closed his eyes, smiling, clutching his pillow. Marcus sat beside him, feeling a new weight on his shoulders. He wasn't just seeking justice for his father, but for all those silenced, like Robbie's mother. Leaving the hospital, Marcus glanced back at the room's window. Robbie sat there, small but with strikingly bright eyes, as if he were the bridge between two generations, those who fell and those who must carry on. Marcus gripped the notebook tightly, knowing it would ignite the final confrontation. A question echoed in his mind. If Harold was willing to bury a man's life, what would he do when this notebook was exposed to the entire community? Sunday arrived, and the small town rippled like a lake struck by a stone. Homecoming Sunday, Mount Olive's biggest annual event, where families returned and shared songs and meals brought healing. But this year, the air was heavy. News from the police station had leaked, and every soul entering the church knew they'd witness more than a service. Marcus stepped through the heavy wooden door, his breath slowing as the tense atmosphere enveloped him. Every pew was filled, ceiling fans turning slowly, unable to dispel the heated strain. The choir sang, but their voices trembled, lacking their usual certainty. They sang as if to mask their fear. At the pulpit, Harold stood. His dark suit couldn't hide his trembling hands. He looked down at the congregation, his face striving for dignity. But his eyes wandered. Beside him, George's usual chair sat empty, a gaping wound in the ceremony. Marcus sat in the middle pew, Robbie's mother's notebook tucked in his jacket. He felt each heartbeat like a drum in his ears. Around him, eyes turned, waiting not just as Elijah's son, but as the voice for a conscience buried for 25 years. When the hymns ended, Harold opened his Bible, his voice rising. God teaches us to forgive. But his words were cut short by a cough from the back. Then, another voice, trembling but clear. Forgiveness isn't hiding. Forgiveness isn't silencing the truth. The congregation turned. The silver-haired choir director, who'd wept recalling Elijah, stood, clutching an old Bible. Silence spread, so thick the ceiling fan's hum was deafening. Marcus knew the moment had come. He stood, legs heavy, but his voice steady. He walked down the aisle, each step echoing on the wooden floor. All eyes followed. As he neared the pulpit, colored light from the windows bathed his face in reds and blues, like the community's wounded history. Marcus pulled the notebook from his jacket, holding it high. This is the record kept by Robbie Hark's mother, he declared. A faithful secretary who died carrying a secret she couldn't voice. But she wrote it down, and what she wrote matches the confession you've heard from George. The congregation stirred, whispers rippling like waves. Harold tried to mask his unease, stepping forward, lips moving. It's a forgery. It has no legal weight. But Marcus didn't retreat. He opened the notebook, reading aloud. March 12. Harold requested not to record, transferred privately. The trembling words stood in the light, like bleeding wounds impossible to hide. The congregation fell silent. Young members shook their heads, exchanging glances. Elders bowed their heads, eyes wet. Sighs and soft sobs filled the cramped space. Then, from the back, a man's voice rose, trembling but firm. Elijah spoke the truth. We abandoned him. Marcus closed his eyes, letting the moment's weight crash over him. This wasn't just an accusation against Harold, but a confession of the community. They'd chosen silence, the easy path, over standing with a man who gave his life for justice. Harold stood frozen, gripping the pulpit, sweat rolling down his temple. His eyes scanned for support, but met only cold stares. No one stood with him anymore. Marcus placed the notebook on the pulpit, gentle as laying down a flame. He didn't need to say more. The words had spoken for themselves, and the congregation had heard enough. Outside, the church bell tolled noon, its long peals echoing, like a call from the past, reminding them that the truth had finally risen, in the very place that tried to bury it. As the bell fell silent, the The crowd dispersed in clusters, whispering, glancing at the empty pulpit. Harold had left long ago, hurrying out the back door like a man blown off balance by the wind. A liminal feeling hung in the air. They'd seen truth flare, but darkness still loomed. Marcus didn't leave immediately. He sat in the front pew, gazing at the vibrant stained glass windows glowing in the midday light. In the red, blue, and gold shards, he saw his father's silhouette, resolute, unwavering. But he knew the truth didn't end here. Harold remained a dangerous piece. Unlike George, who wept in confession, Harold was different, cold, cunning, ready to sacrifice anyone to protect himself. Across town, Harold sat alone in the parish office. The once tidy room was in disarray, drawers open, papers scattered. On the wall, a portrait of Elijah, with the pastoral council, hung crooked, dust thick. Harold stared at it, eyes bloodshot. Memories crashed like thunder. Elijah, that year, standing in this room, voice firm, "We must go public. God's people deserve to know." George panicked. Harold roared that unity mattered more than truth. But Elijah wouldn't yield. That night, hot blood mixed with the basement's musty smell, the sounds of struggle, gasping breaths. Then, silence, a silence that haunted Harold for 2.5 decades. Now, those silent walls were cracking. George had confessed. The secretary's notebook surfaced. The congregation was turning away. Harold felt the ground beneath him splitting, pulling him into a bottomless abyss. On the desk, an unopened bottle of whiskey. Harold poured a glass, hands shaking. He swallowed hard, hoping the burn would consume his fear, but it only fueled the fire in his chest. He thought of the police, prison, the community's scornful eyes. He'd risen to power in a pastor's robe, and now it was a noose around his neck. In desperation, Harold opened the bottom drawer. A heavy envelope emerged, cash, neatly stacked 20s and 50s. He'd kept it for emergencies, and today was that day. The thought of escape flashed. Leave Arkansas, vanish to a place where his name meant nothing. But as his trembling fingers touched the envelope, he caught his reflection in a mirror. A haggard old man, eyes red, no longer the dignified pastor, just a criminal fleeing the light. Outside, the sky darkened fast. A summer storm rolled in, thunder rumbling as if to remind him that all sins faced judgment. Harold stood, tossing the envelope onto the desk. He moved to a safe, pulling out old files, fake invoices, forged receipts, traces of 25 years of deceit. He meant to burn them but froze. Deep down, he knew fire couldn't erase the truth. It lived in the hearts of survivors, in the old notebook, in Marcus's memory. A knock at the door startled him, not the police. An elderly congregant, seeking him after the service. The man, trembling, said he still believed Harold could explain, that he hoped to hear the truth from the pastor's mouth. Harold stared, silent. In that moment, he saw himself in the man's eyes. A once revered pastor, now a distorted shadow. When the congregant left, Harold sank into his chair, head buried in his hands. He understood, confess, or drag the lies on until everything sank with him. Outside, Marcus drove past the church, headlights illuminating the bell tower. He stopped, staring at the dark windows, wondering what Harold was doing in the shadows. Part of him hoped Harold would choose the light, confess, and let go. But deep in his gut, he knew. Those who lived by lies too long often chose to die in them rather than face the light bare. Rain pounded the town, heavy drops hammering the church's tiled roof. Marcus couldn't sleep. He stood by his apartment window, watching the slick streets glow under yellow lights. An unease stirred. Harold wouldn't stay still. The events of Homecoming Sunday were like fire catching dry straw, and a desperate man burning could torch everything to drag others down. The phone rang at midnight. Detective Miller's voice was brief, tense. "Harold's gone. His car's not at home. We think he's planning to flee town." Marcus paused for a few seconds, then said, "He'll go back to where it all began." He sped through the rain, the winding road leading to the church. Lightning flashed, illuminating the towering steeple. In the darkness, a lone light glowed from the pastor's office window. Marcus entered, the wet wooden floor creaking. The smell of smoke was thick. Harold sat there, a pile of papers smoldering in a metal bin. The fire cast his shadow on the wall, twisted like a demon's form. He looked up, eyes bloodshot, voice hoarse. "You came, just like your father did, coming to stop me." Marcus didn't respond. He looked at the flames, seeing invoices, forged receipts, all the evidence Harold was trying to consume. But fire could only destroy paper, not memory, not the notebook Marcus had given the police. "You still have a chance," Marcus said, voice calm but firm. George confessed. "The truth is out. Don't let your legacy be ashes and lies." Harold laughed, a broken sound. "The truth?" He raised a trembling hand toward the fire. "The truth killed me 25 years ago when Elijah refused to stay silent. He wanted to destroy everything. I just wanted unity. But he chose truth over us." A heavy silence fell. Marcus stepped closer, eyes locked on Harold. "No, you're wrong. You didn't protect unity. You protected power. And my father paid the price." Outside, police sirens wailed, red and blue lights flashing through the windows. Harold flinched, looking out, then back. In his eyes, desperation turned to primal fear. He stumbled back, bumping the crooked portrait of Elijah. The frame fell, glass shattering. Elijah's eyes stared from the photo, stern, as if still questioning. Harold collapsed into his chair, hands covering his face. The fire in the bin died, leaving gray smoke curling upward, heavy like a burned soul. The door burst open, police flooding in, surrounding him. Miller stepped forward, reading his rights clearly. Harold didn't resist. He sat, eyes empty, like a statue cracked apart. Marcus stepped back, leaning against the wall, breathing heavily. Within him, the storm calmed, replaced by a deep sorrow. This wasn't a victory's joy but a bitter closure. A life was lost, a community torn, and now the final culprit bowed his head. The next morning, the sky cleared, the ground still wet from the night's rain. Marcus stood on the cemetery hill, where police were exhuming the old grave. As the bones were placed in a new coffin, his heart felt heavy yet lighter than ever. Elijah Freeman would finally rest in the light. No longer bound by the darkness of deceit, the Mount Olive community gathered, saying little. They stood shoulder to shoulder, silently witnessing, like a cleansing ritual. Tearful eyes turned to Marcus, not just as the pastor's son, but as the one who brought truth back to them. As the coffin was lowered, Marcus whispered, "You didn't abandon me, Dad. I won't abandon you." For the first time in 25 years, his shoulders felt lighter, as if Elijah's invisible hand rested on them, comforting and blessing. After 25 years, the final secret shattered. Marcus had found the truth about his father's death, not in numbers or guilty confessions, but in the courage to face the darkness. That truth brought pain but also freedom. Elijah Freeman was no longer just a missing victim. He became a symbol of integrity, a man who chose truth at the cost of his life. Through this journey, Marcus rediscovered the faith he thought he'd lost. He understood justice never came easily, but light found a way through the deepest cracks. This story isn't just about a family, but an entire community. Silence let sin fester for decades, but when truth rose, it didn't just free the departed, it liberated those living in regret. We all face a choice, silence for ease, or speaking for what's right. Marcus chose to speak, and through that, his father found peace. The Mount Olive community, though wounded, now had a chance to heal with genuine faith, not walls of lies. If you followed this far, I want to hear your thoughts. Do you believe truth always finds a way through darkness? Or is silence sometimes the easier choice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to catch the next part of this story series. The question remains, will Marcus leave with his father's legacy or stay to continue the path? The answer may open a new chapter,